Some nurses forget their place and try to practice medicine. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 5 hours before federal agents walked him out of St. Michael's in handcuffs. The fluorescent lights hum over ICU Bay 7 at St. Michael's in San Antonio, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. Natalie Hayes stands at the bedside of an unconscious Army Ranger, his uniform soaked through with blood from a training accident that happened somewhere north of the city at 0600 hours. She has been a civilian nurse here for 8 months, her scrubs crisp white with the hospital's logo embroidered on the chest, her movements efficient and practiced and utterly invisible among the controlled chaos of a Level 1 trauma center. Her hands move through the work without hesitation, cutting away the fabric, assessing the damage, logging vitals in the electronic chart with the kind of meticulous attention that would have impressed the nursing supervisors if they had ever bothered to watch. The dog tags catch on the fabric as she cuts. They tangle in the shredded sleeve, catching on a thread, and she carefully untangles them with steady fingers. The metal is cool against her palm, worn smooth from years of wear, the Ranger's name embossed clearly, Mitchell. SPC Austin Mitchell. Army, not Special Forces. Young, probably 23 or 24 based on the enlistment date stamped into the metal. She reads it once, commits it to memory in that way that soldiers learn to do, and then places the tags carefully in the patient belongings bag. Logs them. Documents the time they were recovered, 0743 hours. Signs her name in the chart, N. Hayes, RN. The tarnished military challenge coin in her pocket presses against her hip like a secret. It has been there for 18 months, worn smooth from her fingers, finding it during stressful moments, pressing it between her thumb and forefinger when the weight of 2 identities threatens to crack whatever composure she maintains. Nobody at St. Michael's knows about the challenge coin. Nobody at St. Michael's knows about the first Afghanistan deployment, the 4 combat tours that came after it, or the reason she can identify the angle of a femoral artery bleed just by watching the pattern of blood loss. Nobody at St. Michael's knows she is here on assignment from Naval Intelligence, watching for a pattern that has already claimed at least 13 veterans in this hospital alone. She is invisible, and invisible is exactly how she needs to be. Dr. Caldwell enters for rounds at 0815 hours, residents trailing behind him like ducklings trying to match the pace of something that doesn't care if they fall behind. He is tall, moving with the kind of arrogance that comes from a trust fund and a medical degree from Yale, and he moves through the ICU bay with the confidence of someone who has never been told no. His eyes settle on Natalie as she finishes documenting the Ranger's initial workup, and she feels the weight of that gaze the way you feel the moment before a helicopter takes fire, that split-second awareness that something dangerous is about to happen. "Miss Hayes," he says, his voice pitched deliberately loud enough for the residents to hear. "A word about your charting." She doesn't look up. Her jaw tightens, barely perceptible, a micro-expression of muscle tension that she has trained herself to control. She sets down the tablet and turns to face him, her eyes level, her face composed with the kind of stoic expression that comes from 18 years of watching senior officers humiliate junior enlisted personnel and learning to absorb it without flinching. "Doctor," she says. Just that one word. No inflection. No apology. He holds up the tablet, and she can see the documentation she filled out, the vitals, the time logs, the careful notation of the dog tags discovered and secured. "This level of detail is excessive," he says, and now he is walking, gesturing with his free hand, playing to the residents who are watching with the kind of nervous attention that comes from knowing their evaluations depend on the approval of men like Caldwell. Some nurses forget their place and try to practice medicine. I would suggest, Miss Hayes, that you spend less time on paperwork and more time on patient care. The bedpans need emptying. Surely that is within your scope of practice. The residents laugh, not because it is funny, but because Caldwell laughed first, and that is how hierarchy works in teaching hospitals. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, and Natalie can feel the moment crystallizing, the way critical incidents condense into memory. She does not flinch. She does not feel her face flush, does not experience the trembling that comes from humiliation. Instead, she feels something colder settle into her chest, the kind of clarity that comes from combat, from the knowledge that this man is expendable and that she has less than 6 hours before federal agents will walk him out of this building. "Of course, doctor," she says, her voice smooth as ice water. I apologize for the attention to detail. She takes the tablet back from his hands, her scarred fingers brushing against his deliberately, and she sees him flinch at the contact. He probably has never touched skin that has been burned in an IED explosion, or sutured under combat conditions, or held the hand of a dying soldier in a combat hospital in Helmand province. She turns back to the ranger in the bed, dismissing him, and she begins documenting his medication administration with the same meticulous attention he just mocked. Caldwell stands there for a moment longer, uncertain how to respond to being dismissed by someone in scrubs, and then he moves on, the residents trailing behind him like the current trailing a ship. She hears them move to the next bay, hears his voice rise again in that practiced tone of academic superiority, and she closes her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Her real mission is in that chart she just filled out. The pattern started 8 months ago, and she has been documenting it in real time, subtle anomalies in medication administration, dosing protocols that deviate from standard care in ways that are difficult to notice unless you are trained to see them, unless you have stood in a combat hospital and watched battlefield triage, watched what happens when medical professionals prioritize volume over care. 13 veterans admitted to St. Michael's over the past 18 months. 13 unexpected deaths, all listed as complications, all documented with a kind of casual acceptance that comes from the hospital's blame-the-patient culture. All bearing Caldwell's signature on their charts. She knows what he is doing. She has known for 4 months now, and she has documented every deviation, every suspicious pattern, every moment where the dosing fell outside protocol. She has submitted her findings through encrypted channels to her handler at Naval Intelligence, a woman named Commander Sarah Reeves who speaks in monosyllables and operates out of a secure office in Alexandria. The investigation is ongoing. Federal agents have been quietly reviewing the case files. What Caldwell does not know is that his every move has been watched, logged, documented with the same meticulous attention he just mocked her for using. What he does not know is that the unconscious Army Ranger in Bed 7 is connected to the case. What he does not know is that his next decision, the medication he chooses to order in the next 3 hours, will be the moment where he crosses from suspected fraud into active murder, and the moment where federal law enforcement will have everything they need to move against him. Natalie stands at the bedside, checking the Ranger's full lines, and she can feel the weight of it, the responsibility of watching, documenting, waiting. She has spent 18 months as a civilian nurse, emptying bedpans and accepting humiliation, because her real rank, her real authority, her real mission exists in the information only she can gather. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes does not empty bedpans. Nurse Natalie Hayes does. And that is the sacrifice you make when your country needs you to be invisible. She reaches into her pocket and touches the tarnished challenge coin, feels the smooth metal against her finger. 18 years of service. For combat deployments. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 assignment that requires her to let a man like Caldwell humiliate her without response, to let him believe she is just a nurse, just someone who forgets her place and tries to be more than she is. The Ranger's heart monitor beeps steadily, a sound like a metronome, like time itself ticking forward. She checks his pupils with her penlight, documents his Glasgow coma score at 8, notes the time. 09:32 hours. She has a feeling about what is going to happen next. She has a feeling that by the time this shift is over, the pattern will reach its conclusion and everything will change. But that is not her concern right now. Right now she is just a nurse. Right now she is invisible. And she will remain invisible for exactly 5 more hours. Right now she is invisible. And she will remain invisible for exactly 5 more hours. The Grand Rounds procession moves through the ICU like a surgical team on display, Dr. Caldwell at the helm, 12 residents trailing behind in crisp white coats, clipboards clutched like shields. Natalie stands at the Ranger's bedside, adjusting before drip with the precision of someone who has done this motion 10,000 times. The patient's chest rises and falls. The ventilator hisses its mechanical rhythm, steady as a metronome. Caldwell stops. His shadow falls across the bed. "Observe, residents," he says, gesturing toward her like she is a specimen under glass. This is what happens when a nurse develops delusions of competence. Miss Hayes here has documented every breath this patient takes. Every single one. As if her opinion on treatment matters. As if she went to medical school. He turns to the room with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. Some nurses forget their place and try to practice medicine. This one keeps meticulous records as though she's preparing a case for court. The residents shift uncomfortably, pens hovering over clipboards. One glances at Natalie. Their eyes meet for a fraction of a second before she returns to the fore, her expression stone, the face of someone whose thoughts exist in a completely different country. Caldwell's laugh is the kind that leaves a residue on the skin. They move on. Natalie continues working. Her jaw doesn't clench. Her hands don't tremble. This is not her first humiliation, and it will not be her last. 3 Bronze Stars were earned in far worse company than a surgeon with an ego the size of a Range Rover. The challenge coin in her pocket, tarnished from 18 years of deployment, from Marja to Kandahar to places with no names on any map, carries more weight than anything Caldwell could say. She touches it once, a muscle memory from worse days, and the motion is so small that no one sees it. The morning dissolves into medication rounds and vitals checks. By afternoon, Natalie is at the vending machines on the 3rd floor, feeding dollar bills into the metal slot. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead with the kind of sound that gets into your teeth. She selects water, presses the button, watches the bottle drop with a mechanical thud. Caldwell appears beside her, grabbing coffee from the machine next to hers. Up close, she can smell the cologne, something expensive and aggressive, layered over the hospital's omnipresent antiseptic undertone. Your obsessive documentation habits are noted, Nurse Hayes, he says, not looking at her. Perhaps spend less time playing detective with paperwork and more time on bedpans. That's more your speed. The patients don't need their chart analyzed by someone with an RN and a nursing degree. They need their bedpans emptied and their pillows fluffed. He retrieves his coffee. 2 colleagues round the corner, and his voice rises slightly, performing now. Nurses who know their place stay employed, Miss Hayes. Nurses who forget it find themselves very difficult to place anywhere else. The colleagues laugh. Caldwell's laughter is the loudest. Natalie selects her water bottle. Her hands are steady as surgical lasers as she unscrews the cap. She meets his eyes, just for a moment, just long enough that he sees there is nothing there to break, and then she turns and walks back toward the ICU with the kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst thing the world has to offer. She does not tremble. She does not cry. She does not retreat to a supply closet. Instead, she returns to the ranger's bedside and continues charting with the meticulous precision that is the entire point. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, around 3 o'clock, Natalie is retrieving the ranger's updated chart from the physician's lounge when she notices Caldwell's office door is ajar. It is never ajar. Even his office is arrogant, the kind of space that demands privacy. Through the gap, she can see inside, the mahogany desk, the framed diplomas, the credenza along the far wall. And on that credenza, visible through the glass panel, dog tags. Her training kicks in before her conscious mind catches up. She approaches the door like someone who belongs there, pushes it open slightly wider, steps inside. The tags are not new. They are worn from years of service, stamped with a name, Sergeant Marcus Webb. The same Marcus Webb who was admitted to St. Michael's 6 months ago with a shattered femur and compartment syndrome. The same Marcus Webb who died post-operatively from what was documented as sepsis secondary to infection. The same Marcus Webb whose body was cremated, whose family was paid out through a life insurance claim that was processed with unusual speed. Natalie photographs the tags with her phone, her movement economical. This is the evidence she has been searching for. 8 months of tracking, 8 months of monitoring a pattern that the hospital's administration has missed or ignored, veterans admitted with treatable injuries, their conditions mysteriously worsening under Caldwell's care, their deaths filed away as complications. And here, in his credenza, are the dog tags that should not be here. That prove he has been taking them. Collecting them like trophies. The ranger's monitor alarm screams from down the hallway. She moves. The ICU corridor is 60 feet. She covers it in 8 seconds. The ranger's room is a study in crisis, muffled heart sounds, distended jugular veins, BP dropping on the monitor. 76/40 and falling. The patient's consciousness is slipping away, his skin taking on the waxy grey of profound shock. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing the heart. She does not wait for Caldwell. She does not call for authorization. Her training is older than hospital policy, deeper than protocol. She preps an 18-gauge needle, 1.25 inches long, and locates the 5th intercostal space, just below the left nipple. The angle matters. Everything matters. She anchors her free hand and advances with a kind of focus that narrows the world to a single point of insertion. The needle goes in. There is a subtle pop, the needle breaching the pericardial sac, and then the hiss of air escaping as fluid evacuates. She withdraws 60 cubic centimeters of blood, dark and urgent. The patient's oxygen saturation climbs. 68 to 74 to 82. His blood pressure rises. 76 becomes 94 becomes 107. The monitor rhythm steadies from the chaos of shock back into something approaching normal. Sinus rhythm. An older patient in the next bed, a grizzled man with a combat medic tattoo visible on his forearm, faded green ink from a war that has no ending, watches every movement. His eyes track her hands like a man who has seen this procedure performed in dust and sand under fire, with no anesthesia and no time. When the ranger's vitals stabilize, when the immediate crisis passes, the old medic leans toward her and whispers something that makes her entire body go very still. "I know that technique," he says. "You're no ordinary nurse. That's a battlefield procedure. That's TCCC protocol. Who trained you?" For 1 second, 1 single second, Natalie's eyes meet his, and he sees the truth there. Not the nurse. Not the civilian. The person who has held lives together with her hands in places that have no names, who knows the difference between civilian medicine and survival, who understands that some procedures live in muscle memory because they saved lives that other doctors could not reach. Then she turns back to the monitor, back to charting, her composure absolute. The moment closes like a door. But the ice in Caldwell's eyes when he enters the room tells her he has seen something. Not all of it. Not the full picture. But enough to know that the answer to his dominance just shifted. Enough to know that she performed a procedure that someone without advanced training should not know. Enough to make him understand, for the first time, that this nurse is not what she appears. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Caldwell's jaw tightens. His hands clench slightly at his sides. "Who," he says, his voice controlled but edged with something that sounds like a threat, "authorized that procedure?" Natalie continues charting. Her pen moves with metronomic precision. The patient was in cardiac tamponade. Pericardiocentesis was the appropriate intervention. I did not authorize. The patient was losing consciousness and pressure was critically low. I had minutes at best. She enters another number into the chart. 107/62. Stable. He's stable now. Caldwell's face has gone the color of old brick. She can see the calculations happening behind his eyes, what this means, what she might know, how this changes the narrative he has been controlling for 8 months. He leaves without another word, but the way he moves tells her everything. A man whose power has just cracked. A man watching something he does not understand take shape in his domain. 5 hours remain until the Black Hawk lands on the rooftop. The physician's lounge at St. Michael's smelled like burnt coffee and something else, the particular staleness of a room where nobody actually rested. Natalie pushed through the double doors at 12:43 p.m., clipboard in hand, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent 8 months learning exactly which hallways people looked through instead of at. The ranger's updated chart was supposed to be on the central counter. It wasn't. Which meant it was in Caldwell's office. Which meant his door would be locked. Except it wasn't. The door stood maybe 4 inches ajar. Not accidentally. Not the kind of carelessness you noticed. The kind you didn't if you were the type of person Caldwell believed her to be. Just a nurse. Meticulous. Boring. The sort of woman who wouldn't think to look up from her paperwork even if you left her door open like an invitation. She pushed it wider with her foot. No one was inside. The office smelled of leather and cologne, expensive things that clung to expensive things. His desk was precisely organized, pen set at a 30-degree angle, monitor tilted just so, inbox containing exactly 3 folders. Everything a man in control would arrange. Everything a man would arrange who had been in control for long enough to stop worrying about surprise inspections. The credenza was against the far wall. Walnut. Probably cost more than her car. The top drawer slid open without sound. Files. Insurance documents. Billing forms printed on hospital letterhead. And beneath them, catching the fluorescent light like something alive, a set of dog tags. Not the Rangers. She knew the Rangers' tags. These were older. Corroded. The name stamped across them was familiar in the way a ghost is familiar, something you've been tracking for 8 months through death certificates and suspicious billing codes and patterns that made your stomach lock into a knot. Sergeant Marcus Webb. 38th Combat Support Hospital, Landstuhl. Deceased June 14, cardiac complications following extended ICU treatment for non-critical injuries. Except Marcus Webb had died in her file. She'd seen his file. Seen the sequence. The injury, minor pneumothorax, nothing that should keep a man in the ICU longer than 72 hours. The orders from Caldwell requesting extended monitoring. The anticoagulant order she'd flagged. The discharge paperwork that came 3 weeks later, signed off by a cardiologist who worked for a consulting firm that Caldwell's referrals had generated $847,000 in revenue for last fiscal year. But the tags. The tags meant something else entirely. Natalie's hands didn't shake. 8 years of combat surgical training in Marja had taught her that hands shake only when the mind panics, and her mind had moved past panic into that clear, terrible place where everything becomes simple. Caldwell wasn't just padding ICU stays. He wasn't just ordering unnecessary procedures or getting kickbacks from consulting firms. He was stealing identities. Taking the dog tags from dead veterans, soldiers no one was looking for anymore, casualties already processed, grief already administered, and using them to file false claims. Using their names to inflate billing. Using their deaths like currency. She photographed the tags with her phone. 3 angles. Timestamp logged. 12:46 p.m., August 15th. The image went to the secure server she checked every morning at 4:41 a.m., the one that reported to a Naval intelligence task force that had been waiting for exactly this evidence for 8 months. The tags went back exactly where they'd been. She closed the drawer. The office door swung shut behind her without a sound. The problem with understanding the scope of corruption is that it recalibrates your sense of danger. What had seemed like a puzzle, 13 veteran deaths, each one individually explainable, each one separately justified, suddenly became a weapon being held to the hospital's throat. And if Caldwell was this careless with physical evidence, if he was this confident that no one would look, then the ranger upstairs wasn't in the ICU because of a training accident. The ranger was in the ICU because he represented something Caldwell needed. Leverage. Proof of competence. Another casualty to explain, another family to dismiss, another body to bury under paperwork. She knew, the moment she stepped back into the ICU at 12:59 p.m., that something had changed. The monitor above the ranger's bed showed a heart rate of 118. Blood pressure 100/61. Oxygen saturation 91%. All of them trending the wrong direction. All of them consistent with something blocking the blood flow to his right ventricle. All of them exactly what you would see if someone had been systematically underdosing anticoagulants to prevent the patient from healing, to keep the ICU bed occupied, to justify extended monitoring that generated another $14,000 in daily charges. Natalie checked his chart. The last anticoagulant order, heparin, 15,000 units for, had been reduced to 8,000 units. Handwritten in Caldwell's print. No clinical justification noted. No reassessment documented. The kind of small change that looked innocent on paper, the kind of order that a civilian nurse would assume came from some logic she didn't understand, the kind of subtle violence that only someone who had held a trauma patient's spine together while shrapnel fell like rain would recognize. She was reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath needle when the ranger's monitor flatlined the heart rate. Not literally flatlined, the rhythm showed a pericardial effusion causing tamponade, the pressure around his heart blocking the chambers from filling properly, the oxygen saturation collapsing from 91 to 78 to 64% in maybe 45 seconds. His eyes opened. He gasped. The machine screamed. Code blue, someone called out, but Natalie wasn't waiting for Caldwell or the code team or any other physician to arrive and assess and deliberate. She had 2 minutes. Maybe 3 before the ranger's brain started dying. Her hands moved. Not her conscious mind. Muscle memory. The kind of memory that comes from 100 combat surgeries in field hospitals where the difference between waiting for authorization and acting on your own was the difference between a soldier who walked out and a soldier who didn't. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line, angled toward the shoulder. A flash of blood in the syringe. A hiss as 50 milliliters of serosanguineous fluid drew out and the pressure released and the ranger's oxygen saturation spiked back to 82, then 88, then 94. His rhythm came back. Sinus. Strong. The kind of miraculous moment that happened when you got the pathology right the first time. Caldwell's voice cut through the ICU like a knife through water. You just performed a surgical procedure without physician authorization. His face had gone the color of old bone. That's termination, Hayes. Natalie calmly noted the procedure in her chart. Timestamp, 1:03 p.m. Procedure, emergency needle pericardiocentesis, 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. Fluid obtained, 50 milliliters serosanguineous. Result, immediate restoration of sinus rhythm and O2 sat recovery to 94%. Her handwriting was perfect. Steady. The penmanship of someone who had nothing to apologize for. He would have died, she said, her voice still quiet, still deferential, still the voice of the nurse everyone had learned to dismiss. In the 4 minutes it would have taken you to arrive, doctor, his brain would have started dying. His heart would have arrested. She looked at him. Not challenging. Just factual. He needed this procedure immediately. The combat medic in the adjacent bed, a 68-year-old former Army surgical tech recovering from a hernia repair, spoke up. She saved his life. I've seen enough field trauma to know what that needle placement meant. That's not something you learn in civilian nursing school. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of authority. Of knowledge. Of someone who recognized a warrior in scrubs when he saw one. Whatever you're about to do, sir, you might want to think about it. Caldwell ignored him. Turned instead to the charge nurse, the one who had worked for him for 12 years and would do anything he asked because he'd written her glowing references and recommended her for promotions and built a relationship made of small favors and smaller loyalties. Escort Miss Hayes to HR. She suspended pending investigation for practicing beyond her scope. Security arrived. 2 officers from the hospital's internal team, both of them looking uncomfortable because they'd worked with Natalie for 8 months and knew she'd never caused a problem. She set down her pen with steady hands. Removed her stethoscope. Unpinned her badge. And walked out without a word, her face showing nothing. Not resignation. Not fear. Not the trembling of a woman who had just seen her 8-month investigation blow apart. Just the calm of someone who had already survived worse. But Caldwell wasn't finished. While Natalie sat in an empty HR office waiting for an official termination meeting that wouldn't happen for another 6 hours, Caldwell made calls. His first call was to Dr. Richard Sterling, a cardiologist on the hospital board who had personally profited $340,000 from Caldwell's referral network. The second was to Catherine Bancroft, the hospital's chief financial officer, who had approved every one of Caldwell's extended ICU stays and received a $75,000 consulting contract with the supply company Caldwell recommended. The third was to Judge Michael Hayes, no relation, whose daughter had gotten a medical school recommendation letter from the hospital thanks to Caldwell's intervention, and who understood favors the way certain men understood them, as currency that demanded repayment. There's a problematic employee, Caldwell told each of them. She's been conducting unauthorized investigations, making accusations, destabilizing morale. I need the board to be aware before she escalates this to external parties. He called her nursing school references, mentioned her name to the director of the state licensing board, a casual comment about boundary violations and emotional instability that would be impossible to prove but impossible to dismiss. He contacted his brother-in-law's medical investigations firm and asked for a priority audit of Natalie's previous patient cases, searching for ammunition, looking for any procedural deviation he could weaponize. By 4:11 p.m., Natalie received the official termination email. For cause: investigation pending. Paid suspension through end of business. Do not return to the hospital premises. A letter would arrive at her home address within 48 hours outlining the allegations. Her nursing license would be flagged. The state board would receive a preliminary complaint. Everything legal. Everything deniable. Everything the work of a competent man who had just realized that his empire was threatened and was moving to burn it down preemptively. She sat at her kitchen table that evening in the house she'd rented under her civilian identity, the cover she'd maintained for 8 months, the life she'd built so carefully that even her landlord wouldn't recognize her real name. The tarnished military challenge coin, the one from her first deployment to Marja, the one she kept in her scrub pocket, the one no one had thought to ask about, sat in front of her on the table, catching the light like a small accusation. Her 7-year-old daughter Emma found her there, tears streaming down her face, the weight of 8 months of invisibility suddenly collapsing into the single terrible fact that she'd blown the investigation. The cover was exposed. The mission was dead. The evidence would be explained away. The witnesses, the combat medic, the charge nurse, would have their own careers threatened if they spoke. Caldwell had already prepared his defense. Already activated his network. Already made sure that the word of a civilian nurse performing a procedure beyond her scope would be outweighed by the word of a respected physician who'd managed his reputation like a general manages the battlefield. Mommy. Emma's small hand touched her shoulder. Why are you home? Why are you crying? Natalie couldn't answer. Not without revealing everything. Not without destroying the one normal life her daughter had left to believe in. She picked up her phone, opened the secure server, and sent a single message to her naval intelligence handler, cover blown. Investigation compromised. Awaiting further instruction. The response came back in 4 minutes, sit tight. Verify nothing. Say nothing. We're 3 hours ahead of him. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical monotone above the ICU when Caldwell's voice cut through like a scalpel. Suspension. Effective immediately. You are no longer authorized to work this unit, this hospital, or any facility under St. Michael's administration. His words carried the weight of institutional power, the kind that crushed people quietly, through paperwork and policy, through phone calls made behind closed doors to 3 board members he'd enriched through fraudulent referrals. Natalie stood motionless in the hallway outside the ranger's room, her hand still damp from the procedure, her scrubs bearing the copper stain of a man she'd just saved from death. She did not flinch. She did not blink. Her jaw tightened once, then released. That was all Caldwell got. He waited for her to argue, to plead, to show him the satisfaction of a woman cornered. It never came. She simply nodded, one small movement, and walked toward the locker room, leaving him standing in the hallway, furious at her composure, at the fact that he could fire her and still feel like he'd lost. In the ICU bay behind her, the ranger's monitor showed a steady rhythm. 78 beats per minute. Sinus rhythm. The oxygen saturation had climbed to 96% and held there like a prayer answered. Chest X-ray showed the pneumothorax resolving, the needle decompression doing exactly what her hands had known to do before her brain had time to think. The combat medic in bed 7C had watched the whole thing from his own gurney, watched her needle insertion at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, watched her move like someone who'd practiced this intense under mortar fire, watched her hands move with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgeon who'd operated in worse conditions than any civilian hospital could create. When she'd finished, when the hiss of air escaping had ceased and the patient's color had pinked back to human instead of cyanotic gray, the old medic had whispered words that made her blood freeze. "I know that technique. Combat medicine. You're no ordinary nurse." Natalie had simply placed a gloved hand on his shoulder and walked away without responding. Never confirm. Never explain. The mission required her to remain invisible, and invisibility meant accepting whispers without acknowledgement, accepting suspicion without answering, accepting the near exposure as collateral damage. But now invisibility was a luxury she no longer had. The parking lot rain fell in sheets, hammering the asphalt like applause from a crowd that didn't know it should be cheering. Natalie sat in her 2009 Honda Civic, economical, forgettable, the kind of car no one noticed, still wearing her scrubs because she couldn't bring herself to change, couldn't turn this day into something cleaner than what it was. The drive home took 17 minutes. She'd made it 1,000 times. This time it felt like the longest drive in San Antonio. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way they'd been trained, the way that would keep her steady if the vehicle went into a spin. Her breathing came slow and measured, for count in, 6 count hold, 8 count out, the same technique she used in trauma bays when everything was chaos and her hands needed to remember their steadiness. But her chest had started to constrict somewhere around mile 5, and by mile 12 her vision had begun to blur at the edges. At 5:32 p.m., Natalie Hayes sat alone at her kitchen table in her small house on Magnolia Street, still in her scrubs, and felt something inside her fracture like tempered glass exposed to sudden cold. The tears came without permission. They streamed down her face with the force of 8 months of compartmentalizing and collapsing at once. 8 months of standing silent while Caldwell humiliated her. 8 months of documenting his systematic underdosing of anticoagulants to extend ICU stays and inflate billing codes. 8 months of discovering 13 veteran deaths that traced back to his choices, Marcus Webb among them, the dog tags she'd found now proof of identity theft and fraud. 8 months of waiting for the federal investigation to reach critical mass. And she had destroyed it in 30 seconds. One emergency procedure. One moment when her training had overridden her orders, when the imperative to save a life had superseded the imperative to maintain cover. The Ranger would live. But the investigation was bleeding out on a hospital floor, and she was powerless to stop it. The tarnished military challenge coin from her first Afghanistan deployment lay on the table in front of her, worn from 7 years of being carried in her scrub pocket, pressed between her fingers during briefings, gripped in her fist during the 314 nights she'd spent in the field without family. The metal was warm from her palm. It bore no denomination, no official seal, just a boot, a crossed rifle, and a date, March 2017. The year she'd learned that pain was information and that the quiet ones in the room were usually the most dangerous. She'd kept that coin through medical school, through nursing certification, through the past 8 months of pretending to be ordinary. And now it felt like a relic from a life she no longer had access to. Her hand shook as she gripped it, not from fear, but from the controlled fury of someone who had just watched everything she'd built get dismantled by a man who was still free, still underdosing patients, still collecting kickbacks from the orthopedic supply company he'd redirected all of St. Michael's post-operative referrals toward. The front door opened at 5:24 p.m. Emma, 7 years old, coming home from the neighbor's house where she'd been picked up after school, bouncing in the way children do when they're excited to tell their mother about the spelling test and the playground incident where Marcus Chen had pushed her off the monkey bars but she'd landed on her feet. The words died in her throat when she saw her mother. Natalie sat at the table still in her blood-stained scrubs, the challenge coin clutched in one fist, her face streaked and raw. Emma's entire body went rigid. "Mommy." The voice was small, uncertain in a way that only a child's voice could be. "Why are you home early? Why are you crying?" The question broke Natalie's composure into smaller pieces. She looked at her daughter, at the girl who had her eyes dark and serious, at the girl who had asked 3 weeks ago why Mommy worked so much, at the girl who didn't understand that the woman sitting at this table was no longer just a nurse pretending to be ordinary, was no longer just a mother pretending to be singular in her devotion. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer with a blown cover, a failed mission, and no way to explain any of it. If she told Emma the truth, that Mommy had saved a man's life and gotten fired, that Mommy had found proof of something terrible, that Mommy had broken 8 months of careful planning to do what was right, she would be revealing classified information to a 7-year-old, and worse, she would be explaining that the world sometimes demanded that you choose between your child and your mission, and that missions don't wait for you to put your child to bed first. "I'm okay, baby," Natalie whispered, and Emma came to her, pressing her small frame against her mother's shoulder, confused and scared in the way children are when they sense that something has shifted in the architecture of their safety. Natalie held her daughter and felt the magnitude of her failure compress in her chest like a stone. Caldwell was still employed. He was still prescribing. At that very moment, he might be making rounding decisions on 7 patients, decisions about medication timing and dosage adjustments, decisions that could determine which veterans lived and which ones didn't. Dr. Marcus Chen, age 42, came to the hospital, and when his chest pain turned into cardiac tamponade after a routine post-operative day because his anticoagulation had been deliberately withheld, no one would have a Master Chief Petty Officer standing in the ICU to know what to do. The Ranger would survive. The dog tags Natalie had found would eventually lead someone to Marcus Webb's file. But how many more would there be? How many more soldiers would trust the institution to heal them and instead find Dr. Caldwell's calculations determining that their extended suffering was worth $847,000 in fraudulent billing codes? Emma fell asleep on the couch at 6:12 p.m., exhausted from confusion and the need to be close to her mother. Natalie sat on the floor beside her, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of childhood sleep, and felt the quiet rage of someone who had just realized they'd been outmaneuvered. Caldwell had moved with surgical precision, suspension, not termination, which meant she might appeal, might fight, which meant he had time to destroy evidence, to contact his allies, to ensure that anything she claimed would be categorized as the desperate accusations of a disgruntled employee with a security clearance revocation pending. She didn't have institutional power. She didn't have a law degree. She had nothing but meticulous documentation in a secure server that no one could access without the right clearances, and those clearances were about to be stripped away by his calls to the Admiral's office claiming she'd performed an unauthorized surgical procedure, operating beyond the scope of nursing practice, endangering a patient through recklessness. At 6:15 p.m., her phone vibrated silently against the kitchen counter where she'd left it. A single text from an unknown number, "Stand by." 2 words. They were meant to convey patience, meant to suggest that forces were moving, meant to tell her that the Navy hadn't abandoned the investigation. But they felt like air leaking from a balloon, like the last breath before the lights go out. Natalie didn't respond. She didn't call her handler. She simply watched her daughter sleep and waited for whatever came next, knowing that her life had split into before and after, that the woman who'd been sitting at her kitchen table at 5:32 p.m. was no longer the same woman who existed now at 6:18 p.m., and that everything had changed in the space between one moment and the next. The Ranger opened his eyes at 11:27 p.m. in the ICU recovery unit, and the first thing he asked wasn't where he was. It was who had saved his life. The combat medic sitting beside him, a grizzled sergeant named Holloway with a face like weathered granite, didn't hesitate. The civilian nurse. Hayes. She did a pericardiocentesis without waiting for orders. Needle in, air out, you came back. The Ranger's hand moved to his chest, feeling the bandage beneath his hospital gown. That technique. That's not civilian medicine. Holloway nodded slowly. No. It's not. Within the hour, investigators from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service were reviewing security footage and patient records, cross-referencing every detail Holloway had provided. But it was the Ranger himself who handed them the keystone. As consciousness fully returned, as the morphine cleared enough for memory to surface, he sat forward in bed and told them about the dog tags. She showed me dog tags, he said, his voice still rough from the breathing tube. "Told me they'd been found in my uniform. But the name on them." He closed his eyes. "That was Marcus Webb. My best friend from Charlie Platoon. We served together in Helmand Province. He died here 6 months ago. Complications from surgery, the hospital said." The investigator, a woman named Torres with the precision of a scalpel in her bearing, didn't move. But everyone in the room felt the temperature drop. "Marcus Webb. You're certain?" "Certain as breathing. We went through RASP together. 75th Ranger Regiment, same cohort. His parents got a flag at his funeral. I was there." Torres made a call. It took for minutes. Within that time, federal agents who had been waiting for just this kind of corroboration began moving in coordinated silence through St. Michael's Hospital. They'd already been monitoring the system since 6:15 p.m. NCIS had installed surveillance software on the hospital's administrative network 3 hours prior, waiting for Caldwell to make his final catastrophic mistake. He made it at 12:34 a.m., sitting at his desk in the darkness of his locked office, certain that he was alone. Caldwell's hands moved across his keyboard like a man possessed. His career was ending. He could feel it the way a drowning man feels the water closing over his head. The Ranger's survival had been the wrong outcome. The NCIS presence on the floor, the investigators' questions, the chart review that had started appearing in his inbox an hour ago, all of it meant exposure was imminent. There was only one move left. Destroy Natalie Hayes' credibility completely. If he could prove she was unstable, incompetent, dangerous, if he could backdate performance complaints to support her termination, then her testimony would be discredited. Her observations about his dosing protocols would look like the paranoid notes of a disturbed employee. The records would show he'd been documenting her problems for months. He had the access. He had the authority. He had the digital signature tools. His fingers found the personnel database and he began to type, fabricating disciplinary reports dated 3 months prior, inserting signatures that mimicked his boss's handwriting, creating email exchanges that never happened, building a false architecture of documented concern that would crumble the moment anyone looked at the server logs. But he wasn't thinking about logs anymore. He was thinking about survival. He was thinking about making this go away. At 12:37 a.m., Special Agent Torres' phone buzzed with a message from the IT surveillance team. "He's in the system. Active file modification on employee record 7742. Multiple fabrications detected. Timestamps anomalous." Torres didn't hesitate. She moved toward the administrative wing with 3 federal agents, their footsteps barely audible on the linoleum, the kind of purposeful quiet that comes from people who have done this hundreds of times. Caldwell didn't hear them until the door opened. He didn't have time to close the screen. "Dr. Robert Caldwell, step away from the desk," Torres said. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A command that came out of her mouth like a weapon. Caldwell's face went the color of old bone. I was updating, hands where I can see them." The handcuffs were steel cold when they touched his wrists, and they clicked shut with the sound of finality. His Miranda rights were read in a voice that carried no malice, only procedure. His brother-in-law's investigation firm was being raided at that exact moment 6 blocks away. The 3 board members he'd enriched through fraudulent referrals were receiving visits from federal agents carrying subpoena documents. His medical supply company contact in Houston was being arrested with over $40,000 in kickback documentation already seized from their office safe. The anticoagulant underdosing protocol, the scheme that had kept patients in the ICU longer, inflating bills by an average of $47,000 per admission, was unraveling through the meticulous charting that Natalie Hayes had maintained for 8 months straight. Every dosage, every time interval, every deviation from standard protocol. Every moment when Caldwell had ordered half doses or withheld medications entirely, watching complications develop, watching ICU stays extend, watching the billing codes multiply like cancer cells. The billing department analyst, a woman named Patricia Chen who had been flagging suspicious patterns since March, was already sitting down with NCIS investigators, pointing to spreadsheets that showed the correlation between Caldwell's patients and the highest-cost ICU admissions in St. Michael's history. Holloway, the combat medic, was providing testimony about watching Caldwell deliberately delay emergency response to one of his own patients, a 68-year-old Marine Corps veteran named Donald Hutchins, allowing complications to develop when immediate intervention would have prevented them. The delay lasted 53 minutes. Hutchins died of septic shock at 4:18 a.m. on a Tuesday in February. His daughter was in a federal building right now, being interviewed by agents, learning that her father's death hadn't been inevitable. That it had been a choice. That Dr. Robert Caldwell had chosen money over her father's life, and made that choice knowingly, and made it again with 11 other veterans, and would have made it again if he hadn't been caught in the act of destroying evidence, caught in real time, caught the way he should have been caught months ago. As the handcuffs closed, as Caldwell was led out of his office, the hallway began to fill with staff. Nurses emerged from patient rooms. Residents stopped mid-task. The security guard, a Marine named Torres, no relation, but the resemblance to the NCIS agent was close enough that people sometimes confused them, announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Doctor off deck." It was a naval tradition, a courtesy normally reserved for officers, but Torres said it the way you'd announce the removal of something toxic. The words hung in the air. And then someone started clapping. Not sarcastic. Not angry. Just slow, steady, deliberate applause that came from a young resident who had watched Caldwell humiliate nursing staff for 3 years. Then another pair of hands. Then a third. By the time Caldwell reached the elevators, the sound had become a wave, and he couldn't look at anyone. He stared straight ahead with the blank expression of a man who had finally understood that the world had moved on without him, that his power had been an illusion built on fear and institutional tolerance, and that tolerance had expired the moment he tried to erase Natalie Hayes from the record books. 3 years later, Emma pressed her small hands against a chain-link fence in the parking lot of a strip mall on San Antonio's south side, in the district where people sold plasma for grocery money and checked accounts charged fees to cash their paychecks. "Is that really him, Mom?" Her voice carried the careful neutrality of a child who had learned not to expect the world to make sense. Natalie nodded once, her navy dress whites immaculate in the afternoon sun, the new commission bars on her shoulders gleaming like promises kept. At a folding table between a cell phone repair kiosk and a check-cashing establishment, Dr. Robert Caldwell sat in a cheap polo shirt, gesturing half-heartedly at pamphlets for supplemental insurance that nobody wanted. His medical license had been revoked in 2019. His assets had been liquidated for victim restitution, every dollar of it distributed to the families of the 13 veterans whose deaths he had hastened. His prison sentence had ended for months ago. This was what remained. Not redemption. Not second chances. Just the slow accumulation of days in a life diminished to its essential components, selling hope to people who had learned to stop believing in it. Natalie didn't gloat. She never had. That wasn't what this was about. In her dress uniform, heading to Landstuhl Medical Center in Germany where she would train the next generation of combat medics, where she would teach the same life-saving techniques that had exposed her true identity and ended her cover operation, she was already moving toward the next mission. The ranger she had saved, fully recovered, his name was Stephen Torres, no relation to the federal agent, had graduated from her training program last month. The combat medic who had recognized her technique during that emergency procedure was now her co-instructor, teaching other field medics the precision that separated survival from sacrifice. On her office wall in Landstuhl hung a shadow box. Inside it, mounted against black velvet, was the tarnished military challenge coin from Afghanistan, the one she had held at her kitchen table while her cover collapsed, while her daughter slept upstairs, while the world spun toward a reckoning she couldn't yet see. Beside it lay Marcus Webb's recovered dog tags, linked to 12 others, representing 13 veterans, 13 lives whose stories had been reduced to billing codes and negligent silence. The morning sun from the German window caught the metal, and it threw light across the office like a benediction. Emma tugged her mother's uniform sleeve as they walked away from the strip mall, away from the folding table, toward the airport that would take them back to Germany. "Why didn't you say anything to him, Mom?" Natalie's eyes stayed forward. "True class is what you do when the lights go out, Emma. He had none. That's why he's there and we're here. They walked past the vending machines one final time, the same machines where Caldwell had mocked her, where he had threatened her, where he had treated her like someone small and dismissible. He didn't even see them leave. He was too busy calling after strangers who didn't stop, who didn't want his insurance, who had learned long ago that people like him only smiled when they were taking something. The dog tags caught the sunlight every morning in Landstuhl, a reminder that some missions take 3 years but justice eventually lands, and that the quietest person in the room might just be holding the truth that brings down everything else. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of hidden strength and quiet courage. Like and comment if you believe real heroism is what you do when nobody's watching. The stories that matter most are the ones we almost never hear.